Well, thank you, Betty. That was excellent. You know, we've gotten a lot of perspective from the science and from the veterinarians. And our last speaker for the day before we bring our panel back up is Mr. Chris Vowles, who has agreed to come in and give probably the most important perspective on working with these models, the husbandry and operations, the day-to-day grunt work of making these things work. So, Chris, we'll get you hooked up here. That should work. And Chris is from the University of Michigan, and he was kind enough to, this is the one that gets hooked on,
Okay.
so let's get that set up for you. Put it on somewhere. As close to your throat as you can.
Okay.
So that goes on your belt. Okay. We'll test it. See if people can hear you.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Push forward and back, and I don't know where the pointer is on this one. Okay.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Chris Vowles, and my presentation today is about unique challenges and future directions related to managing mouse gnotobiotic husbandry facilities. So we'll go over the challenges in maintaining the germ-free colony itself. This includes national standards, germ-free animal health, access to the animals, and staffing, and of course everyone's favorite, funding, right? In the latter half, we'll go over some of the future directions related to the gnotobiotic experimentation, including how we do start our research, some of the traditional experimental housing, and a little bit in depth of our procedures in using the alternative bioexclusion system. So first off, a little bit about the core itself, its function and purpose. Half the staff and resources are dedicated to maintaining the germ-free colony itself. This includes husbandry and colony management. The other half is dedicated to the research portion of the core. So this includes allocation of mice to experimental space, collaboration with the investigators, and design and execution of the experiment. One of the major challenges that we face here is national standards. There's a lack of gnotobiotic guidelines nationally. The term gnotobiotic or germ-free are only seen 3 times in small paragraphs in the guide. And there's also animal use committee concerns as well, such as why we don't physically change out the cages into the isolator. And the physical look of a dirty isolator, even though we know microbially the interior of the isolator is sterile, okay? This is one of the most important slides of the presentation, right? I think as the gnotobiotic community should come together, have an open dialogue, and create some of these standards in the next few years. So a little bit about germ-free animal health. Germ-free animals exhibit an abnormally large cecum as they age. This can occasionally lead to a gut twist. So this is a nice pathological picture of how big a cecum can get in a germ-free animal. Okay? There's also the challenges of nutrition. There's heat degradation to feed when you autoclave it. Specifically, thiamine and vitamin K are susceptible to this. Other institutions use supplements to remedy this, and they also turn to irradiation for their sterilization of the feed. This is often unreliable and usually requires additional autoclaving anyway. Another challenge is the access to the animals itself. Core technicians and veterinary staff are the only people allowed in and out of the isolator. We train the veterinary staff, so the local veterinary technicians and the faculty vets, on how to operate in the interior of the isolator and comfortably work in the isolator so they can examine the animals. And they're guided through this process so that they feel more comfortable and more confident in working in these isolators. There's also the issue of treatment too, if you wanted to treat an animal within the isolator. Most medications are sterile and new as long as the package is not compromised in any way. But we must externally sterilize these types of medications, right? So first off, we would peel that label off and to where it's just bare metal on the tube, or peel the label off on that glass vial and cold sterilize it by soaking it in chlorine dioxide for 30 minutes before we even place it into the isolator and observing a 24-hour contact time before we even enter it. So it's a long time before we can even get medication inside of an isolator. So of course, when externally sterilizing the packaging is extremely important. There's also the issue of staffing. There's a real severe lack of experienced staff in this field. It often takes 6 months of training, real intense training for a new staff member to be trusted to go on their own, to do their own procedures, in either preparing the port of an isolator or doing gnotobiotic experimentation. And there's a high level of fatigue in doing this job. It's pretty intense. There's lots of attention to detail. There's a lot of high stress. And you cannot make any mistakes. You could lose months and months of work just contaminating an isolator by touching something that might be dirty and then maybe entering it in the isolator in poor aseptic technique. There's also the personality traits, which I think were touched on a few times before. A little dash of OCD, right? There's a high attention to detail in this type of work. And there's also the ergonomic burden. You're reaching in really hard places to reach to try to pull materials into the isolator. You're gowned up in plastic gloves, your face is pressed up against plastic, and you can be working like that for hours at a time. So it can be very difficult. And there's, of course, funding is also an issue, and I'm sure everybody is very familiar with this. It's very expensive to run the core. We take up a lot of space. We require a lot of labor, especially in prepping the materials, sterilizing these materials before we do any of these procedures. It takes a long time. We're usually at least a month ahead in prepping these materials. And it is extremely unrealistic for the core to support itself on user fees alone. Alternative sources of funding are especially needed for this. And there's, of course, also the issues of staff salaries, right? These are specialized trained gnotobiotic technicians, and there's really no standard for this kind of compensation. Convincing your local HR department that a gnotobiotic technician deserves a little bit more than another technician, and probably the first question you get is, what is a gnotobiotic technician, right? So again, now we're moving on to the experimental side of the core. The first step is if a principal investigator wants to work with us, the first thing they do is fill out what we call a user request form. And this form contains all the pertinent information, such as the duration of the experiment, what type of strain, the protocol, how they're going to pay for it, right? All the information is located on this form. We'll review this and look at the type of experiment that's proposed. And if it's something like we've never worked with the investigator before, or we've never sterilized a piece of equipment, say a microscope, maybe there's a pump or something involved with the experiment, we'll provide additional consultation for that. Okay? Once we're satisfied with that consultation and we believe the experiment could be a success, we'll then schedule that experiment. Okay? Now there are 3 types of housing that we can use for the gnotobiotic experimentation. Now the first type is the most obvious. It's using soft-sided bubble isolators. Okay? Now the pros of this is you can use basic PPE. So plastic gown, gloves, a little bit of alcohol. You're in the isolator. You can start manipulating your groups. Okay? Another pro is a real low risk of contamination using isolators. This is a double barrier system. And you can see I don't have my pointer here, but you can see the port, 2 barriers there. So it really lowers the risk of entering or exiting materials. And in this type of housing or isolation unit, you can have large experimental population options. So you could have 30 mice in this isolator in different cages. But the problem is you can only have 1 microorganism or 1 group of microorganisms at a time. Okay? And cross-contamination is unavoidable within the isolator because you cannot sterilize your gloves between these groups. Okay? So they're considered 1. And we also need a 24-hour advance plan. So what this means is if the investigator requests fecal samples or gavaging, or we need a 24-hour notice because that's the contact time it takes to wash the port, sterilize the port before we enter or exit anything out, okay? This type of housing, isolation unit for gnotobiotic research is ideal for like geriatric studies or food studies, something that's long-term, maybe even 9 months to a year, okay? This is the type of housing that we'll use. And think about this as we're going back to the consultation process, right, for the user request form. This is something we consider when we're reviewing that. And of course, this is a large footprint with low mouse density, okay? This goes back to our space problem. The second type of housing, which is the more traditional type of housing with gnotobiotic experimentation, is using Class 2 biosafety cabinets. So when using these cabinets, strict asepsis is followed, and surgical sterility. So we're donning in sterile PPE. We have sterile gown, glove, bonnet, and mask. And the pros of this is easy access. So you can do this within 30 seconds, break the air curtain, start working with your groups, your different Gnotobiotic groups. And it's also good dexterity. So you just have thin gloves on, a nice comfortable gown, and you could be working hours like this, so it's definitely a benefit. And you can also use basic static caging. These are normal basic static caging. There's nothing special about them. They've been sterilized, aseptically introduced into the sterilized cabinet, and assembled within the cabinet, okay? Now, of course, the cons of this is limited space. This cabinet is probably 6 feet long, 2 feet deep. So you can only fit up to maybe 5 groups, including your controls, okay? So cross-contamination is really risky in this type of situation. Remember, you're doing husbandry, you're doing gavaging, you're doing fecal collections. All these different things need to happen, so and you need to change in between those groups too, okay? There's also a large footprint and low mouse density with this method as well. So our third type of housing, and some of the newest type of housing, which has been brought up a few times in this talk, is using hermetically sealed independent ventilating cages, okay? Now, this type of unit was originally designed for ABSL3 work. And interestingly, ABSL3 procedures are an exact mirror image of Gnotobiotic procedures, okay? So what they did was they would just reverse the technology. Positive became negative, negative became positive, and now you have a unit that can be worked with Gnotobiotic research, okay? This type of unit is made by Technoplast, a company called Technoplast. And the model is an IsoCage P system, okay? Let's look a little bit in depth on how these cages work. This is the complete cage setup here. So you have the lid right here. There's blue wings that will secure the lid on top to the bottom of the cage. The white tabs then lock in, securing that connection. There is a valve up on the top left. Oh, thank you so much. There's a valve right up here at the top is an exhaust valve. Over here is your supply valve, right? So when the unit takes in air from the room or an HVAC hose, it HEPA filters the air through the manifold system and then comes through the cage, and each cage is individually HEPA filtered. So through this supply system, goes through an individual HEPA filter, begins circulating through the cage, and exhausts out through the valve, okay? Now let's pretend we opened up this lid, flipped it upside down, and you can see over to the top right portion here, the silicone gaskets that's between the lid and the box, sealing the two, right? And it's kind of hard to see, but then this is a little close-up of those valves. It's a double gasket system, so basically it's just a valve with a spring and 2 O-rings. So if it's open or closed, it's sealed either way, okay? And then this is a close-up of the cage actually being docked onto the unit. So the white nozzle is your exhaust. The red nozzle here is your supply. So when you dock the cage, air circulation happens. Immediately when you undock the cage, hermetically sealed, okay? So remember, you have a finite amount of air that's in this box, okay? These are essentially small isolators. There's really no difference between this other than the double barrier system. There's another type of bioexclusion system that's on the market as well, and it's made by a company called Allentown, and it's the SPP, or Sentry Positive Pressure System as well. The only reason why we're using the Technoplast system, it came out years before, so we started using that first. Okay, this is a quick overview of that procedure. So the first step is we sterilize the Class 2 Type A biosafety cabinet. Then we externally sterilize the isopositive cage unit. And we're aseptically donning in sterile PPE where we place the cage into the cabinet. Then we aseptically donning in sterile PPE. We're then able to open the cage lid within the cabinet to manipulate our groups. And the definition of manipulate here is gavaging, husbandry, fecal collection, anything to do with manipulating within that box. That's the definition of this manipulation, okay? Once we close the lid and we're done with what we're doing, we then decon the cage, because remember, we've touched the interior of the cage, which could be contaminated. We're closing the lid back on, so we could have contaminants on the outside of the lid. So we decon the cage, okay? A little bit closer look into this type of procedure here. So the first step, sterilizing the cabinet. You can see here in the top right picture here, I'm spraying the interior of the biosafety cabinet with chlorine dioxide. Notice the papper. Okay, this is home pesticide sprayer that we filled with chlorine dioxide. And the next step is to physically wipe down the bottom portion of the workstation of the cabinet. This is really important as well. Okay, and the next step is to sterilize the exterior of the cage. Okay, remember these are hermetically sealed. Okay, so in the top right picture, you can see the cage completely submerged in chlorine dioxide, right over here. Completely submerged, we observe a 5-minute contact time of complete submersion. And remember while we're doing this, there's contact time and sterilization happening to the cabinet as well in the previous step. So that's happening while we're sterilizing this cage. Once our 5-minute contact time is up, we then pull the cage out and place it into the cabinet. Notice basic PPE and the papper. Now we're aseptically donning in sterile PPE, so then we can enter the sterile cabinet and start manipulating our groups. Lifting up the lid, placing it upside down to our left, being as clean as possible, we can then do what we need to do. So this is adding water, gavaging, fecal samples again, right? We then close the cage and decon. And this is just spraying it again with chlorine dioxide. We're spraying the outside of the cage and we're spraying our work area. After this, we then place it back onto the unit. And the process just repeats itself over and over, okay? This whole process takes us about 15, 20 minutes. We've gotten really good at doing this. We could do this with 1 or 2 people, a lot easier with 2 people, but there is a procedure that we can do it solo, okay? Now there are limitations to this type of system. The sterilant that we use is chlorine dioxide. We use Expor. It's made by Ecolab. It used to go by the trade name Elside. You can also use Clydox as well. We prefer Expor because it has a lathering agent, so it bubbles up and it seems to stick to the surface area a little bit more, allowing a longer contact time. Okay? It's very toxic, though. And the contact time, too, takes a long time to do this type of procedure, right? And it's also toxic, thus the papper. And it is highly corrosive, okay? This is what happens when chlorine dioxide meets high-grade stainless steel. This is within 48 hours, okay? So it damages equipment, costs more money, and of course the time, right, it takes. The time it takes to also prep these materials too. We're prepping all these materials in advance, about a week in advance, and we're sterilizing these. You have to have all this ready before you start doing these procedures. It takes a lot of time and labor, okay? Then there's a problem with cross-contamination, right? This double rack unit can contain 71 cages. And we were initially using 1 cabinet to do all these procedures. And that can kind of create some problems, especially with cross-contamination. So we introduced the idea of rotating cabinets, right? So we would sterilize 3 cabinets in a row, and we can load up our cages, do our manipulations per these groups, take a break because you are wearing a papper and you're doing this type of work, and then repeat that process. It created a more efficient way to do this, okay? There's also maintenance issues, and I might want to add, our procedures go highly against the manufacturer recommendations on how to use this unit, okay? It's been told many times to me. So, but there are very important maintenance issues when dealing with this, such as the valves that are on the top of the lid, the springs that are loaded up so the valves can go in and out. They deteriorate, and the plastic, of course, deteriorates. And remember what we're doing with these cages. We're autoclaving these cages at a really high temperature. We're exposing them to a corrosive sterilant. Then we're deconning them again in the autoclave. And then after that, they get thrown in a tunnel washer, where it's a really high temperature. And then that process repeats over and over. Okay? It can really damage a lot of this equipment. So this needs to be constantly maintained and inspected. Okay? So the biggest question we get when we're using this unit is, can sealed IVC units replace isolators? Okay? Well, great, I can get rid of all my bubbles. I don't need to do this. I can get this rack and start my own colony in this rack, and it can be a lot easier, save a lot of space. And the short answer is really no, okay? So isolators are just safer to house your Axenic colony and then be able to transfer your Axenic mice to this system. It doesn't mean that you can't keep germ-free animals on the unit. It just means it's easier to rear the mice in the isolators and then be able to transfer over to this system, right? And there's also high risk of this due to high husbandry needs, right? So if you're breeding on this rack and you have a pair of mice and they have a litter, you could be changing that cage just in husbandry maybe 2 to 3 times a week. And that's 2 to 3 times of that procedure you're going to have to do on 71 different cages. It's a lot easier just to go into the isolator, do husbandry, and then be done with it, right? Okay. With that, there are huge advantages of using this unit, okay? So to give you an idea of this, before we had 9 Class 2 biosafety cabinets in one room doing the traditional way of experimentation, okay? And this was roughly 20 to 25 cages. And a maximum, of course, of 9 experiments per these 9 hoods, and about 456 square feet of space. This was all replaced by one 71-cage double unit, okay? And what this did, this really opened things up, right? Like I said before, you could have maybe 4 to 5 plus your control different groups in a cabinet. With this, you can have 30 if you wanted to, right? But it kind of tipped the balance, right? Now our limitation is mouse availability versus space, okay? So to give you an idea of our efficiency in using this unit, in 2014, probably spring, we received the unit and we started tinkering around with it, so wasn't really fully operational. We completed 84 experiments in 2014. 2015, we really got going. We got a procedure down on how to use this, and we completed 120. And this year, we're projected to do over 130 experiments, and this is a staff of 4, okay? And of course, there's a lot of variables to these numbers. Shorter experiments, longer experiments, of course, you know. But the overall idea here is that it's increasing our efficiency in doing the experimentation, and then in turn, shorting our wait list down for our users. It used to be 9 months, and we're probably around 3 months wait. So we're on a first come, first served basis for our PIs, okay? This, of course, increased our funding with more user fees generated. And of course, it's not completely sustaining us, but it does make a dent, and we're getting there, right? We're kind of increasing more funding here. So in summary, some of the challenges that we face, mainly with the colony, is national standards, of course. Funding. This is especially true for up-and-coming and new laboratories. They really need the funding to really buy these isolators and buy these units, hire the staff. So funding is an issue just for everyone involved. And of course, some of the future directions. An alternative sterilant is really needed. And I know this is odd because you're using a sterilant that is meant to kill organisms. It's going to be toxic. It's going to be corrosive, most likely, but it's definitely needed, right? And hermetically sealed IVCs is a major advancement in gnotobiotic experimentation, at least for us, okay? So I'd really like to thank our director, Dr. Catherine Eaton, my colleagues Sarah Poe and Natalie Anderson, and Tricia Danicki. Without them, none of this would be possible. And of course, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's been a tremendous honor to speak with you today. So thank you very much.